created image because of the radical identity of the powers of the soul, meaning they're not accidental to the soul, nor are they really distinct from the soul. The will doesn't function independently of the intellect. And so the will always have, in both God and in his created image, a relation and a dependency in some sense upon the intellect and thus truth. So the kind of voluntarism posited by Bonaventure and Scotus is not one of a denatured will separate from the intellect and indifferent to the truth of a being or the good ends of that being. No, the will is always situated and embedded within the unity of that being as an infinite being or as a rational, created, finite, personal substance. And so what the voluntarism then that Bottoni is talking about is not a nominalist or arbitrary voluntarism. It's rather a recognition that knowledge and charity have a certain relative dignity. And this is because knowledge is something that happens to the mind. The mind receives some object of truth, and the truth itself informs the mind. It acts upon the mind in a way that, in a way that it makes the mind act in a certain way and come to a certain state. But the will, on the other hand, the will is always spontaneous. The will always acts out of its own resources in response to the truth in the mode of love. And so there are two factors at issue. One is they would speak of, or Bottoni would speak of, a kind of voluntarism, because intellect operates in a natural mode, which is not free and not spontaneous, and will operates in a voluntary mode, which is free and spontaneous. And thus, by its operation as free and spontaneous, the will can love and act and move towards the good, whereas the intellect only ever becomes conformed to the good, but it cannot act in a positive and spontaneous manner. And so Scotus and Bonaventure see then it's really through the will that a person, as a spontaneous, independent agent, moves in response to the truth it knows and seeks to unite or realize the good that's presented to it. And so there's a relative dignity of the will and of love over intellect and over knowledge, because the will more clearly and completely manifests what it means to be a person and what it means to act personally. And so in that sense, there is a voluntarism, because the Franciscan tradition recognizes a certain primacy of the will in terms of the dignity of its operation, because the will acts and the will loves, and in terms of the superiority of charity over mere knowledge. I think of the passage in the book of James, where they're talking about the truths. The apostle James is talking about the truths of the faith, and he says, it's a great thing, good job. The devils know this and tremble. But obviously their knowledge of God's plan and his activity doesn't make them saints. And so there's something more than knowledge that is required in order for a person to operate in the fullest sense of their own dignity and in terms of fulfilling their purposes. So that's what I mean by, or that's what Bottoni means by voluntarism. It doesn't mean an independence or an arbitrariness of the will in terms of its nature and in terms of its end. It rather means a relative dignity of the will and of love over knowledge and intellection, based upon the intrinsic good of love over knowledge. So any questions on that point? I'm sure there are. Yes, Brother Charles.
Any comments on the comments that this Franciscan voluntarism, while it may posit love as the superior and the goal, that it um, you could say genealogically, it's connected to Ockham. That's sort of it's still on the straight and narrow, but it's a step towards this slippery slope.
Well, no, I don't think you can affirm that. I think you may be able to affirm that terminologically if you're unfamiliar with the metaphysics of Bonaventure and Scotus as compared to the metaphysics of Ockham. Because Ockham didn't affirm first of all, he didn't affirm that the intellect or the will had in themselves any kind of formal nature specifying what they are that is common, that is able to be realized in multiple instances in the case of created persons. He understood the intellect and will as really, in terms of our understanding, in terms of what we might call form, he understood intellect and will in terms of merely the concepts that we apply to an experience that we have. So he was very skeptical about whether or not intellect and will, qua intellect and will, are common natures. He said the most common thing that we can have is really our concepts. And so this is what is called nominalism. We name the will in a certain way, but we name it on the basis of our mind's operation that makes these faculties common and able to be understood on a universal level, instantiated or realized in many different individuals. Whereas Scotus and Bonaventure very clearly understood that the intellect and the will had within themselves a certain integrity and nature that imposed themselves on the mind and were the conditions out of which, or the cause for the mind's activity of coming to an abstract or common notion or concept of the will. So in this sense, Scotus and Bonaventure understood the will not to be merely a concept, but intellect and will to have a common nature that every instance of intellect and will would share. And this is even further the distinction between what we would understand or root in Ockham in terms of the negative voluntarism becomes even clearer. Because if Ockham, on the one hand, said we really don't have, or we can't legitimately say there's a nature or a common reality of will and a common reality of intellect, well, there also really isn't a common reality of what we might call the divine substance. We really have no way to say there's any unity there. And so he would say, okay, the divine will can manifest itself just through however it manifests itself, in any way we discover it manifesting itself. Because the divine will has no natural continuity with the divine intellect or with the divine being. And so God's power through his will can become radically arbitrary. And this again is rooted in Ockham's belief that our concepts of a universal kind do not necessarily map onto anything in the world or outside of the mind, even in this case, the divine being. Now, Scotus is very clear and helpful on this point because he does distinguish between the powers of memory, intellect, and will in God. He says these three powers are formally distinct from each other. But remember, a formal distinction doesn't imply separation, separability, or independence. A formal distinction simply notes that memory, intellect, or will, in terms of their formal definition and in terms of their actual operation, are not able to be said of each other. So you simply can't say that memory is really will and will is really memory, because they're irreducibly distinct. But because they're not separable, there's no real distinction. So we say there's a formal distinction. And by the same token, each of these powers, memory, intellect, and will, are also formally distinct from the divine being, not really distinct. Okay? Because the divine being says more on the one hand, and it says less than memory, intellect, and will taken together or independently or separately say. And so we're operating with multiple concepts, realizing that these concepts refer to natures, irreducible formalities, what Scotus would call quiddities, that are distinct from one another, but not distinct in such a way to imply or induce composition or separation, make God a complex being. God is simple, but God's simplicity is not, it's not a negative simplicity in Scotus, it's a positive infinity. And by a negative simplicity, and this is more of a Thomistic account, simplicity in St. Thomas is simply the absence of any limiting principles. And for St. Thomas, a limiting principle is either material or it's formal. So any kind of finite essence, say the essence of dogness, the essence of angelness, the essence of acornness, all of these are limited principles, or limited principles, and thereby limiting principles with respect to the matter in which they inform. And so with St. Thomas, then, for divine simplicity to be predicated of God, what he's saying is that God doesn't have any matter, and he doesn't have any of these forms, like dogness, squirrelness, any of these finite forms. And so in that sense, simplicity is kind of a negative thing. We can't really say much about it, other than God isn't like a creature. Now with Scotus, he will affirm God is simple, but his simplicity is one that's more positive. He understands simplicity as a being that is in itself most maximally perfect and possessing every perfection in the most maximal way that doesn't imply a limitation. So all of these perfections that God has that we can name, and we name these perfections mainly from our own understanding of created beings, such as being itself, wisdom, justice, rationality, volition. All of these faculties are spiritual. And in their very spirituality, they don't imply anything limited. There's a possibility that these things, these spiritual realities could be maximally realized in a maximally perfect being, in an infinite being. Whereas the essence of catness, there's no such thing as an infinitely perfect cat. Because a cat's a limited being by essence, and a cat always is composed with matter, and matter is always a limiting principle. And so you don't predicate these qualities in any way of God except eminently, meaning God can create these kinds of beings, but God isn't a cat. But you can say God is justice in an infinite way. And so for Scotus, he would say then, memory, intellect, and will are all maximally or infinitely realized in God. And by dint of this infinite or maximal realization, they're identical to his essence in a real ontological sense, because his essence is maximal or infinitely realized. And so we say God is infinite being. But if God is infinite being, then, of course, again, against Ockham, anything that you say of God will be infinitely realized and infinitely perfect. So thus the will be perfect of itself because it's infinite being. Knowledge or intellect will be perfect of itself because it's infinite truth. And so the voluntarism that follows out of Ockham is impossible with Scotus because of Scotus's positive understanding of divine infinity. Because God is an infinitely perfect being, whatever God does or any essential characteristic or quality of God will also be infinite. And infinity for him is a synonym in this instance for perfect or absolutely just and ordered. And so in this sense, both Bonaventure before Scotus and Scotus are at a real essential division between themselves and Ockham. Ockham, in a sense, took a lot of the language of Scotus and the logical apparatus of Scotus, but he completely refounded metaphysics. He doesn't in any way have the same metaphysical understanding or articulation. And I think the most simple way of locating, and hopefully we get to this later on in more depth when we look at Scotus particularly, the easiest way, or the most fundamental divide metaphysically in terms of what we know and what we can say about things in themselves, is that where Ockham says really there's nothing but the singular, and the singular is absolutely basic in every sense and in a sense exclusive. Thus, when we speak about things, we're only ever speaking about singulars and developing concepts that we then apply or can use more or less successfully to other singulars. So if Ockham emphasizes singularity throughout the entire scale of what we can know and what exists, Scotus, while affirming the priority of singularity, because singularity has to do with real existence, he, in some sense, when he speaks of natures, he supposes commonness as actually basic and prior to either singularity or a universal concept that we have in our mind. So there's this notion of a common nature that explains how we can talk about singular instances or individual instances of a kind, let's say Fido and Rover. They're two different dogs. They have two different forms in themselves, but yet we speak of them as both being equally dogs. And we also have a concept of dogness that we can apply equally to Fido and Rover. So Scotus says the reason we can have universal concepts and there are singular instances of a kind is because there is this notion of a common nature. And that notion of a common nature we'll have to come back to, because it's a little bit opaque and it's not ultimately justified in terms of our experience. It's rather posited in a certain way because of our experience. We say there must be a common nature because we know singulars and we know universals. Singulars in the world, this dog, that dog, and we have abstracted concepts in our mind that we can use to recognize this dog, that dog, and see, oh, they're both a dog. So does that explain a little bit better?
That does help, because it shows that there is an irreducible difference.
Oh yes, in terms of ultimate metaphysics, there really is no similarity between Scotus and Ockham. In fact, they're worlds away. On terms of the common nature and metaphysics, they're absolutely worlds apart from one another, even though they do share similar terminology and make similar logical moves, or at least use logic in a similar manner. And I think really the logic question and the terminological question is the fact that they're both recipients of a commonly developing tradition at Paris in the late 1200s, early 1300s through the 1320s. And so it's really not so much a continuity of thought, it's rather just a continuity of context and environment that explains their similarity. And, by the same token, looking back to Bonaventure, there is a great deal of continuity of thought, but to a lesser extent, a continuity of language or terminology, precisely again because there was a great deal of development from Aquinas and Bonaventure, who both passed in 1274 to 1300, and the rise of Scotus and then later Ockham a few years later. And so people often confuse, or they assume because there's a similarity in terminology and scholarly apparatus that there must be a similarity in thought. And they also, on the other hand, assume because there is a dissimilarity in terms, there must be an equally dissimilarity or a corresponding dissimilarity in concepts. It's really a strange understanding of intellectual genealogy on this question, simply because everyone recognizes that St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure taught and wrote and were educated in a very similar environment, but they have very different positions on certain questions. And so, if there can be similarity and discontinuity with Thomas and Bonaventure, I see no reason why there couldn't be similarity and discontinuity between Ockham and Scotus. It's just an inconsistent application, or a failure to recognize concepts and terminology don't always equal or have the same implications. Anyway, hopefully that helps. A few more comments about Bottoni. I think the key ideas to get out of Bottoni, and I'm looking for my copy, in terms of philosophy, is the recognition of Bottoni that St. Francis had this insight into the radical overflowing goodness of God and the ultimate or final richness of the concept of goodness in relation to being, unity, or truth. They're all equally basic, and in a sense, each states the same thing in a different mode or under a different aspect. And we say different words, well, because we're not infinite. We don't see it all at once. But in some sense, then, epistemologically, being or unity is prior than truth or goodness, because you can't have truth without a being, and you can't have truth without a unified being in an ultimate ontological sense, and certainly you can't have goodness without unity or truth. And I don't think that's the point the Franciscans make about privileging goodness over, say, truth or being. They're not saying goodness is more than truth or unity. They're saying goodness is a richer concept that's inclusive of unity and truth and being. In a sense, goodness is the best linguistic and philosophical tool we can use to unpack and mine the truths of reality itself, either God, divine reality, or created reality. And so St. Francis understood then this radical priority of goodness in this sense because he understood the radical love of God and the Father's paternity in creating and then sending his Son to save us and redeem us. So in that sense, there's a radical insight into the priority of goodness that is rooted in God's personal action of creating, becoming incarnate in his Son, and saving us through the operation or the work of Christ in the Spirit. And really, this reality was I think it's strongly attested to in the text of Scripture and in the text of the patristic tradition. But in a sense, St. Francis came on to the scene at a unique time and had a unique role in re-emphasizing the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man in Christ, and the priority of charity and the Holy Spirit. You might call this the first and true French Revolution, playing off the name of Francis. Instead of fraternity, equality, and what was the other one? Liberty, fraternity, and equality. In St. Francis, you have paternity, fraternity, and charity. And this maps on perfectly to the triune essence of God through the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're all sons of the Father. We're all sons of the Father in Christ, and we're all united through the charitable operation of the Spirit that is sent from the Father through the Son and is mediated through the operation of the Immaculate Mediatrix of all graces. So in this sense, Francis affected the first French Revolution, but the what do they call it? The cour de cri, is that how they say it? The cry of the heart, or the cri de coeur? I'm thinking too much as a Latinist. The cry of Francis's heart was paternity, fraternity, and charity, not liberty, equality, and fraternity, whatever the French revolutionaries said. And I think this is important because this primordial insight then, in that chapter that Bottoni wrote, The Philosophy of the Canticle of Brother Son. Let me see, what chapter is that? Chapter 5 and following, what you find then is what the Franciscan tradition does through Bonaventure and later Scotus is simply translate and apply these insights of St. Francis into the realms of philosophy, theology, spirituality, and ethics. And we'll see later on in St. Bonaventure, hopefully, that the table of the Ten Commandments, the first table that speaks of the priority of paternity, honoring God, and the first commandment of the second table, honoring father and mother, is rooted primarily in this understanding of the need to recognize and reverence paternity. that paternity, as St. Paul said, in heaven, by whom all fatherhood is named. And so ultimately, even in the Ten Commandments, which many take to be just simply dictates of natural reason that any human being can arrive at, the Franciscan tradition in Bonaventure sees, yes, that's true. These are things that should be knowable by human reason, but ultimately these truths themselves have a Trinitarian coloration, or ultimately a Trinitarian foundation, because these truths of creation and how we ought to act in creation are ultimately rooted in the paternity, what Bonaventure will call the fontal plenitude of the Father, who is the source of all goods, as James says, the Father of lights. And so those are, I think, key themes to take out of the Bottoni book, and I hope that it clarifies this question of voluntarism a little bit more. Any questions before we move on then? Is that I'm hearing crickets. Okay, now let's transition. We've got a big day before us, and I've already yammered on for 40 minutes, and so I don't think we're going to get anywhere near finishing. But okay, a couple of areas before we move into some comments on Cullen, and then some comments on the Reductione, De Reductione Artium ad Theologiam. The first thing, why do we care about St. Bonaventure? Well, as Franciscans, it's obvious that Franciscans should care. He's a Franciscan. But I think while that's a very important reason, I think Bonaventure is in some ways a broader figure than just simply a Franciscan, in this sense that Franciscanism, as deriving from St. Francis himself, is broader than simply the Franciscan order. In a certain way, Franciscanism, or the Franciscan order, is a particular translation or a particular transposition of the symphony orchestra that Christ wrote into the life of St. Francis, that is particular, that is especially intense, especially manifest or manifestive of the life and charism of the Seraphic Father. But as St. Francis is known to be the man who is totally Catholic and totally apostolic, St. Francis is a saint for the entire church. And in this sense, the Franciscan tradition does well to remind everyone that St. Francis is a saint of the entire church, and thus whatever God did or in St. Francis, and whatever he taught through St. Francis as a type of Christ, obviously probably one of the most radically Christic saints in all of history, the first stigmatist that we know of. To this extent, St. Francis is a teacher and model for all of us. So his spiritual and by implication theological and philosophical insights are not just simply the provenance of the Franciscan order. Rather, the Franciscan order has a duty to disseminate these insights to the wider church. And in a similar way then, we can see in St. Bonaventure that Bonaventure being the first codifier, the official biographer, the first translator of the implications, the theological, philosophical, and spiritual implications of the life of St. Francis into an idiom that can be communicated on an intellectual level and then evaluated and reapplied. St. Bonaventure is a universal saint as well. And so the Franciscan orders have a very special privilege in having someone like St. Bonaventure as their primary doctor and their first theological master, who was always a Franciscan. So again, to return to the question, why care about Bonaventure? And I'll list some reasons now and maybe amplify upon those reasons. In the first sense, or in the first case, Bonaventure presents don't misunderstand me, he presents a relatively complete synthesis. The only other synthesis in Christian theological history, in any order or in any tradition, is St. Thomas Aquinas. Bonaventure presents a complete synthesis of the Christian worldview, inclusive of philosophy, theology, spirituality, that is really unmatched. And this will be especially important. This key fact is especially important in approaching Scotus, how we understand Scotus, how we situate Scotus, how we approach his thought as a whole. Jeremy, did you raise your hand?
No, sir.
Okay.
I got a question. What was that? You said a complete synthesis of the Christian worldview with what?
With what? All I meant was Bonaventure presents a relatively complete synthesis of the Christian philosophical and theological tradition.
Okay, got it.
So this is important. What's that?
Systematic presentation.
Yeah, that's right. An advantage of St. Bonaventure, and you find this when you look at his sentence commentaries and his sermons and his biblical commentaries, more so than the text that we'll be reading, because the text that we'll be reading are scholastic disputations by and large, is the rootedness of St. Bonaventure. His mind seems to have been infinitely or quasi-infinitely capacious in his ability to both assimilate, assess, and organize the entirety of the then known biblical and patristic tradition. In this sense, his mind is suffused with biblical imagery, biblical language, and patristic imagery and language. And again, on this score, in terms of approved theologians in the church, East or West, the only other figures comparable to St. Bonaventure on this score are St. Thomas Aquinas, St. John Damascene, and perhaps to a lesser extent, St. Maximus the Confessor, although St. Maximus never achieves the degree of integrated synthesis that St. Bonaventure, the Damascene, and Aquinas achieve. But St. Bonaventure is especially advantageous then, both as a systematizer, but also as a witness of the biblical and patristic tradition, both in terms of the content and in terms of the organization of this tradition. And so again, Bonaventure stands in an especially privileged place as both a synthesizer and a traditioner himself, but a traditioner who stands as a massive receptacle of the entire preceding tradition. It's just monumental what he does and what he accomplishes in his writings. Third, then, is the fact, along with St. Thomas Aquinas, and then with, I guess we're up to 35 or 36 doctors of the church, St. Bonaventure, with Aquinas, is declared or was declared by Sixtus V in 1588 in the encyclical Triumphantis Jerusalem to be one of the two primary doctors of the church, along with St. Thomas Aquinas. So beyond then the official, or rather Franciscan recognition of the importance of St. Bonaventure and the place of St. Bonaventure in the tradition, he also then has a universal position by recognition of the universal magisterium of the church. So again, he's a figure that is of great ecclesiastical import. Yes?
What was the name of that document from Sixtus V in 1588?
It's in the English, it's Triumphant Jerusalem.
Okay.
And it was the declaration or the bull of Pope Sixtus V, who was himself a conventual Franciscan, declaring St. Bonaventure a primary doctor of the church along with St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think, if I remember right, up to that point, or by the point of this declaration regarding St. Bonaventure, there were only 10 doctors of the church total. You had the four great Western doctors of Augustine, Ambrose, Leo the Great, Pope Leo I, and Pope Gregory the Great, I believe. And then the Eastern doctors of Basil the Great, Gregory Nazianzus, St. John Chrysostom, and another. So you had 8 doctors of the church, and then you had St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure making 10. And St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas, in the Middle Ages, I believe it must have been Pope Pius V, who was a Dominican, who declared St. Thomas a primary doctor of the church. And then along comes Pope Sixtus V about 20 years later and makes St. Bonaventure a primary doctor of the church. So there were 10 total at that time and 2 primary doctors. And so you can see the unique and exalted place that both of those figures have. And another note, and I think I mentioned this somewhere in my own book, but many people today take St. Bonaventure as primarily a mystical writer who doesn't really have much to say about systematic theology or philosophy. And this is in some ways confirmed, or at least rather the impression is assisted by certain statements of Pope Leo XIII and Pope St. Pius X, because both Leo XIII, while Leo XIII recognizes the importance and need to study Bonaventure in his encyclical Aeterni Patris 1879, actually, is that right? I might be wrong on that date. Let me check. Anybody there know?
Not off the top of my head.
1879, that's right. So Leo XIII recognizes the importance of St. Bonaventure as a scholastic. He also calls Bonaventure the Princeps Mysticorum, or the Prince of the Mystics, and St. Pius X repeats that phrase, which he's right. Bonaventure is the Prince of Mystics. There is no one who approaches him in the tradition in terms of the integral presentation of mystical theology that is inclusive of what Bonaventure would call symbolic theology, namely the teaching of the church that's taught to everyone, academic theology, and then mystical theology proper. There's no one that really approaches St. Bonaventure in terms of this total vision and integration. So St. Pius X and Leo XIII were absolutely correct on that. But if you just call Bonaventure the Prince of the Mystics, it might seem to imply the contrary, that he's not a prince of the scholastics. And of course, in that same milieu, St. Thomas Aquinas's work, for other reasons, was being presented as, the privileged philosophical and theological outlook and approach of the church, at least for the Latin church. And so those two things combined, you give the impression that St. Bonaventure maybe didn't have really much to say about philosophy and theology. Another point that needs to be considered is that following 1298, this was the 24 years after the death of St. Bonaventure, all of his disputed questions, except for his disputed questions on, evangelical poverty, his disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ and the mystery of the Trinity were lost, just completely gone. Very strange. And also his great sermon, Christ the one teacher of all, Christus unus omnium magister, that was also lost. And these very important texts that demonstrate the theological and philosophical and dialectical mastery and really flesh out the subtleties and intricacies of Bonaventure's position, they were only rediscovered in the 1870s. And so what you had, go ahead, Alex.
I missed, what did you say? All of his disputed questions were lost, or just a couple of them?
Well, the only absolutely confirmed disputed questions that we have, there are several others, but as far as I can tell, there's dispute on whether or not they're authentic.
Okay.
But the affirmed or confirmed authentic disputed questions, the disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity and the knowledge of Christ, those were lost. And I think the only ones that remained were the disputed questions on evangelical perfection.
Okay.
And
Thanks.
so the fact that those two sets of disputed questions were lost caused a kind of lack of appreciation, and then perhaps a lack of clarity and insight into some of the more subtle refinements of his thought that weren't able to be presented to the depth or in the systematic order and structuring that you find in the disputed questions in the sentence commentaries.
And sorry,
because those were not.
What was the date of the recovery of these texts?
They were recovered in the 1870s, about 1874, 1872, 74. I think it's in my book somewhere. And so this also, because of the loss of these texts, it also served to diminish Bonaventure as a scholastic theologian, one who is skilled in philosophy and theology. And so people were able to read him more as a mystic, because all you had were the sentence commentaries, which is basically a doctoral dissertation, but not a doctoral dissertation arguing any coherent thesis, but rather a big, huge, probably 4,000-page commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, which were organized by Peter Lombard according to topic into 4 books with subtopics in each book. But really what was happening is everybody had to follow Lombard's program. And so they weren't able to present a coherent vision, such as you find in St. Thomas's Summa Theologia, where Thomas wrote that not on the model of Lombard, but on the model of his own presentation of the truths of faith. And unfortunately, with St. Bonaventure, he never wrote a comprehensive Summa. So you don't have the same level of depth and the same extent or breadth of questions in any single work of St. Bonaventure. The closest you have to a Summa in St. Bonaventure is the Breviloquium, which was written in 1257, about 2 to 3 years after he wrote the disputed questions we were talking about. But that is a very brief work. I mean, it literally means a brief word. But what that does present is it presents an overall picture or vision of the entirety of the Christian faith according to Bonaventure's understanding of it, not according to Lombard's understanding of it. And the situation gets worse with Duns Scotus because he never actually wrote his own synthesis of anything. So his synthesis has to be extracted and abstracted out of his commentaries on Lombard or his commentaries on Arabic. So it presents a much more difficult assessment with respect to a synthetic overall view of Scotus. Yes.
What's the earliest? What's the most ancient, the earliest summary by a Franciscan purporting to be of Franciscan thought that we have?
The earliest summary
that we still have.
I think it's the Breviloquium.
Okay.
I think that would be it. I couldn't say for certain, but I think that's it. From a theological perspective, it's the Breviloquium.
How about one that's more the more complete presentation, not the brief presentation, like a Summa?
You don't find summas. You don't find summas like St. Thomas's until you get to someone like Jerome of Montefortino, who lived in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Because even after St. Thomas, the Summa Theologia was not the model of commenting on theology. The sentence commentaries of Peter Lombard remained the model up until probably the middle of the 18th century.
Okay.
And so some people created summas, but really the dominant model was still the sentences of Lombard, which has certain limitations. But okay, so speaking about all these reasons why he could be, kind of shunted off to the side as merely a mystical writer, I think it's important to remember that in the bull of his canonization by Sixtus IV, sometime in the 1520s, I believe, he was noted not as a mystical writer, but as a theologian, as a scholastic writer, and his authority was rooted in that basis. Maybe I can find the text here. Here, no, actually it was in the bull of the declaration of his status as a doctor of the church, and I'll just read it. So therefore, it was less because of his ascetical works than his theological works, meaning his scholastic theological works, that Bonaventure was proclaimed a doctor of the church. And moreover, he was called not merely doctor, but excellent doctor, and reckoned among the chief and primary of those who excelled as masters of theology. So even though when Sixtus V was promulgating this bull of Bonaventure as a primary doctor of the church, he was calling him a doctor of the church precisely because of his scholastic theology and actually downplaying his ascetical or mystical theology. And so the proper ecclesial understanding of Bonaventure, again, is as a true academic theologian with something to teach us in the realms of philosophy and theology, in addition, or in a sense, prior to approaching or trying to assimilate and apply his ascetical writings. And so this is the proper foundation to begin with in understanding Bonaventure as a doctor of the church. He's not just a mystical doctor as, say, someone like St. John of the Cross or St. Teresa of Avila. No, he's primarily a doctor of the church as a philosopher and a theologian, a scholastic. And because of his brilliance and his piety, his spirituality as a scholastic doctor, he is the Prince of Mystics because he was able to perfectly integrate that and apply that to his mystical writings. He didn't bypass the academic.
Thanks for that. Yeah, we're still here.
Well, I mean, we're still here because it's just the, that's just showing the video feed from our camera. It doesn't have to.